A few years back, not as many as I would like, but a few years ago, I was on my way to a church retreat at San Damiano. Are you all familiar with this retreat center? Okay. It's outside Danville. It's in the Ridgeline, and it's beautiful, and I forget what branch of Catholic Brothers runs it, but it's just lovely. And I was going, and I wanted to get a cup of coffee, and I don't know if you have been to downtown Danville, but it's pretty chic. You would not think you're in Santa Rosa. And I parked, and I walked up to Pete's, and as I came up, there was a man who appeared to be living on the streets, sitting on the side of the building. And I was so jazzed about my retreats and getting my Jesus on, and I was like, hey, would you like a cup of coffee? I'm getting one myself. And he said, yes. He would take the coffee, and then he asked me for one of the fancy breakfast sandwiches. And that's when I stopped feeling compassion for him. And I was really annoyed and confused. And I was like, really? I'm not even spending that kind of money on myself. I'm not even getting a latte. I'm just going to get a cup of coffee. And I just felt this, And I said something, I don't remember exactly, to this guy. It was non-committal at best. And I walked inside to give my order. And I know, and we know, obviously, this was not my best Christian moments. I was not very Jesus-like as I had this encounter with this man. And Jesus, as we know, is known for his compassion, and especially in the gospel piece that we're reading this morning, for healing. And he is walking around the countryside healing and telling parables and drawing crowds. And Jairus knows this. And he is the leader of the synagogue, and he comes out to greet Jesus. And we just heard how this powerful, respected man, this community leader, shows huge deference to Jesus and asks for healing, not just for himself, for his family, but for his daughter. And this is like textbook compassion and humility. And his show of faith and strength seems to be rewarded because Jesus and the crowd all begin to follow him towards his large estate. Until there is an interruption. And we know that that interruption is the woman who has been hemorrhaging for years, and she does not ask permission. She does not present herself and her case and beg Jesus for mercy. Rather, she reaches out and takes. She has her reasons, and they are solid, but she does not do all of these socially expected and acceptable ways to get Jesus' attention, does she? And that's probably because, as the scripture says, she has run out of options. She spent all her money, all her resources on doctors who were not able to cure her. And she has been perpetually bleeding, and we can put that together and recognize that she is considered unclean and thus is an outcast and probably living on the streets. She was not supposed to be in the crowd that day. She knew that she was supposed to stay out of everyone else's way. She was supposed to stay out of anyone's way because she knew that just her touch would make someone ritually unclean too. And yet she just goes for it. She has nothing left to lose, and she has everything to gain. And Jesus has every right to be dismissive, angry. Now he's unclean too. And he says, "Who touched me?" And I just love the disciples because they think something is really wrong and they're defensive and they're like, "We didn't touch you. Deny, 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 didn't do it. Not us." And Peter's like, "Hey man, it's a lot of people here. You just gotta calm down there, friend, and get onto that house." But Jesus knows that this wasn't just some jostling in the crowd. And I wonder if he might be more surprised than he is annoyed or frustrated. I wonder if Jesus in that moment knew this woman's entire story from their silent encounter. Because Jesus somehow clearly recognizes her anguish and her desperation and meets her there. He does not demand that she bow down before him, but she does, because that is, of course, what you're supposed to do. You know, I knew what I was supposed to do at that Pete's, so I did it, and I bought the sandwich and 2 cups of coffee, and I had to wait 5 minutes for the sandwich to be heated up. And you better believe I was not happy about those 5 minutes. And so I finally take this meal and this cup of coffee out to this man. And I was grumpy, and there was no thank you, and there was no nothing. He just seemed entitled to this expensive breakfast I had just purchased. And I walked away annoyed with myself and annoyed with this man all the way to the retreat center. And I realized that there was, of course, no reason for him to think anything of asking this of me. Because I was in a swanky downtown, and I had a car, and I was showered and wearing clean clothes, and I could actually afford to buy a hungry person breakfast. I was not going to be homeless the next month because I spent $10 that I hadn't planned on today. And yet, I felt taken advantage of, even though, of course, I could have said no. And now I realize that I was simply judging this man, and I put up walls to protect myself. I wanted to give away $2 when what he needed was much more than breakfast. And I didn't have enough compassion that day. My compassion was very thin at best. And I just imagined that if I had been truly compassionate, I would have imagined how terrible it would feel to need to ask a stranger to buy me breakfast, and then hope that someone, anyone, would come through eventually. But in that moment, I didn't feel this man's pain. I wanted to keep finding new ways to be annoyed and angry or dismissive. I wanted to protect myself with my walls of decency, with my privilege, with my big brain. And I forgot to let my heart meet this person. Now, we all know there are many, many, many differences between me and Jesus. Many. And one of those, of course, is that Jesus has every reason, every human reason, to be annoyed with this woman in front of him. And yet, he, unlike me, had incredible compassion. He did not just feel her pain a little, and he did not list his grievances around ritual purity and decency and order. Instead, he testified to her great faith in God. He testified to her own worthiness, that she would dare to reach out and be healed. Now, I can only imagine what it is like to look to a stranger after they have taken care of one of my basic needs, a sandwich, a healing. And compassion, real compassion, calls me to imagine this and to not look away. Compassion calls me to stay with the moment, the person, and the suffering, and not to run away or look away because I feel uncomfortable. And that means even just jumping into my head, because I can get away pretty fast when I go there. Because we should be uncomfortable when we see a person in front of us who is suffering. And that should never be okay. We can experience God's compassion at any moment, for ourselves, through ourselves. We can find ways to suffer with other people and experience the Christ that is present in our midst when we do so. Compassion asks us to be incredibly vulnerable, to show up with all that we are, take a deep look at the world through someone else's story, and to stay open to how their truth might grade on our own ego and story. we might be changed in that moment. Our presumptions may be challenged. Compassion is brutal and all-consuming. It asks a lot of us. It asks all of us. And isn't that exactly how Jesus calls us to be with one another? Jesus invites us to see the depth of humanity all around us, to be touched and perhaps changed by what we discover, and to live differently from this moment on. As part of our fall worship series on change and change-making, today we're starting at the very beginning with compassion. For if we are to be change makers like Jesus, in this work we need to be really, truly, deeply compassionate, just the way that he was. For God will transform us through radical compassion if we let it. Acting with compassion is full immersion humanity. It takes all of our courage and all of our faith, and it will make our lives worth living. It can reshape us to interact differently with the people in the world around us. So let us be bold in sharing and receiving compassion with one another and trusting that as we do so, we are living into God's desire for us and for our world. May it be so.